What is the best entrepreneur visa for a foreign national to operate their business in the United States? In this video, I'm going to go over the various visa categories that are best suited for entrepreneurs, as well as the permanent residence categories that you can also use to obtain a green card and permanent residence in the US to run your own startup or your own business in the US. First and foremost, welcome back to the channel. I appreciate you being here. My name is Adrian Pandev. I'm an attorney who specializes in helping individuals move to the US through investments and invest and grow companies in the US. And what I'm trying to achieve by these videos is basically provide a lot of information to all of you out there who are wondering how all of this works and how I can make this a reality between all the various immigration, tax, corporate law rules that make this so difficult. So in this video, we're going to go through the various visa categories that probably come into play for foreign nationals who want to run their own company in the US, right? Like there's a lot of information out there about, hey, what kind of visas can I get to work in the US for another company, for how can an employer employ me in the US? The goal of this video is to focus on those who want to be self-employed, right? And this is, to be honest, a topic very dear to my heart because I mainly work with entrepreneurs. Most of my clients are business owners, right? And they're investors. They own their own businesses that they invest in and try to scale. So I spend most of my time navigating these visa categories and then setting up companies and sort of tax structures related to them that allow these individuals, right, my clients, to grow in the US. Now, that being said, let's jump right into this and discuss the various categories. Now, the first thing I want to do and explain is basically there's two separate sets of, call it, types of visas, right? There is immigrant visas, right? Permanent residence, and then non-immigrant visas, which are like your standard visa categories. So the difference is that non-immigrant visas, these are your standard visas, we generally talk about, are issued for a temporary period, and they have a lot of restrictions on the activities that you can perform in the US. Generally speaking, you can only work for the company or organization that sponsored the visa. Now, immigrant visas, which I'm going to refer to as permanent residence or green cards, are that. They're categories that allow you to obtain permanent residence, to live in the US indefinitely, and they also provide a pathway to citizenship because after being a permanent resident for 5 years, you can apply to naturalize to become a US citizen, right? So I'm going to start with the visa categories, the non-immigrant visas, and then I'm going to switch to permanent residence. I'm going to do my best to record videos on all of these separately. I've already recorded a bunch of videos on some of them, but I can't go super deep on each and every category simply because then this will turn into a 5-hour video, and I don't think you want to watch that. So I'm going to give a brief overview of each of them and kind of provide a bit of a pro and con for each of them as I tackle them. So with the visas, right? The first one that comes to mind is your E visas, right? That's an E1 treaty trader and E2 treaty investor visas. Now, these visas, the E2 is granted if you make a substantial investment into a US enterprise, so basically a US company. To put it very bluntly, if you invest money to start a company in the US, that's what the E2 visa is for. That's why it's a great option for many entrepreneurs looking to start their own business in the US. Then the E1 is similar, that it's also a treaty visa, but it's a treaty trader visa, and it focuses more on trade between the US and the treaty country. So instead of looking at that initial capital investment, it focuses more on the trade of goods and services between those countries, right? So if you're in, simple example is an import-export business, but also if you're selling services into the US, the E1 could be a very interesting option for you. Now, the tricky thing with e-visas is that they're treaty visas. They require a treaty between the country of citizenship of the applicant and the United States. There's only so many countries that have e-visas available to them. In some countries, for example, Greece, they have an E1, but not an E2. So the first question before you even look at e-visas is to determine whether your country of nationality, your country of citizenship actually allows you to apply for an e-visa. But if it's an option, it's generally, the e-visas are a great option to launch your business in the US simply because they basically they're approved for a long time, right? So in some cases, in many cases, it's a 5-year visa that you can renew indefinitely. So you could have it for a longer period of time. And spouses of E2 visa holders get unlimited sort of employment authorization, right? So you receive employment authorization that allows you to work anywhere in the US. So it allows the family or a family to move to the US much easier because the primary applicant can develop and grow the business, and the spouse, if there is a spouse, obviously, can go ahead and seek employment in the US, and children under 21 are eligible for dependent visas and can go ahead and go to school in the US. So in addition, to summarize the E2 and the E1 visas, it's a great option. Generally speaking, for those who are from one of these treaty countries, it's very often the go-to option, especially if there is trade or if the business requires a capital injection. But the biggest issue I see is that, simply put, not every country is eligible, right? So that's why we have to look for other alternatives, right? Now, kind of similar to the E2 is the L1 visa. The L1, and that's Larry 1, right? L1 visa is an intercompany transfer visa. So the way I explain it to people is that the best way, and I think this was one of the primary reasons the L1 visa was created, was to allow big global organizations to move talent, right, between their various global offices, right, or facilities, right, manufacturing facilities. Now, the L1 does have a entrepreneur aspect to it because there is a new office L1, what it's called, and that visa was specifically created for someone to come to the US and, as the name says, start a new office or a new venture in the US, right? The beauty of it is that you can be from any country. Unlike the E-visa, there's no treaty country requirement at all, which is nice. The con or the negative side of the L1 is that although it doesn't require treaty country citizenship like the E-visa, it does require an affiliation between the foreign company from which you're being transferred and the US company. So what that means is there needs to be a foreign business that is, at a bare minimum, 50% of the same ownership group has to control both companies. And what that means is that they're both under common control. They can be direct subsidiaries. They can have, completely separate owners that own both. It doesn't really matter, but there has to be like overlapping control, right? They have to be a part of a greater enterprise that way that allows them to be treated as affiliates, right? And on top of that, you have to have worked in that foreign company for at least 1 year in a managerial or executive capacity, it's called. So you basically have to have been a manager abroad for the foreign company for at least a year. And if all of these boxes are checked, the company will be able to transfer you to the US to start the new office US venture. Now, L1 visas generally, unlike E-visas, which focus much more on, to be blunt, money, right? But if it's an E1, it's the trading of goods and the value of those goods. If it's an E2, how much was that initial investment? How much money did you invest? The L1 focuses much more on organization size, right? The focus is much more on, hey, are these companies big enough to be moving people back and forth, right? So I tell everyone there's a lot of planning that needs to go into making an L1, new office happen, because there's a lot of requirements on the foreign company, right? Like the USCIS will scrutinize whether or not the foreign company is at a level where it can do these intercompany transfers of people. But it's a great option. I want you to be aware of the L1. We use it frequently because a lot of countries do not have E-visas, and it's frankly a very viable option, especially for those who have businesses abroad and are basically operating businesses abroad. It can be a great option to start your journey to the US. Similarly to the visa, important to note, spouses get employment authorization and kids can go to school, so it has those same advantages. Now, let's move on to a very different, side of visas, which are unrelated because the E and the L are kind of similar in certain senses. Let's talk about O1 visas, right? Now, the O1 is completely different, right? It's an extraordinary ability visa. Now, I see this one used a lot by people who have been successful, basically successful startup founders, right? And the argument is a bit different than with the other cases where the focus is on, hey, I'm investing this money, I'm doing all this trading, I've developed this foreign company, I'm going to develop a US company, I need to be transferred. The focus is on you, the applicant, right? It's whether or not you are extraordinary as an entrepreneur. And generally speaking, the way you prove that is that you've had success with other companies in the past, or if you're already working in the company that you want to use to apply for the O1 visa, you demonstrate that you have track record of success with this company. The things I'm very direct with my clients that apply for these O1 visas as entrepreneurs. What I focus on is, number one, revenue, right? Like how much money did these companies make? Because generally speaking, in business, that's a main metric to see whether or not a business is successful. Another thing I focus on is raising money, right? Like, have you raised substantial money from, especially institutional investors? So it's not required that you've raised money from institutional investors, but if you've raised a substantial amount of money, and on top of that, you're raising it from big, whether it's venture capital funds or other institutional investors, it proves that people who allocate money for a living are backing you, which proves that you are at the top of your field and a startup founder worth looking at and worth treating as someone who's extraordinary. Now, in addition to these business metrics, right? And I should add, there's other metrics that are not just money related that can show that someone's an extraordinary founder, right? So what is the impact? What is the reach of the business? If you built a global brand, right? Has it developed a huge following? Like there's a lot of metrics to go into this. And I think you can already tell, compared to the E and the L visa, which are much more regimented. Hey, do you check these boxes? You probably apply or are eligible for one of those. The O1 is much more fluid because you have to prove something that is much more discretionary, right? What is extraordinary? And I tell everyone the case needs to be tailored towards your accomplishments, your achievements as a founder, as an entrepreneur, right? Now, in addition to the business's success, we also look at the actual applicant's success. So one example is basically, have you been included on various awards lists, right? Like, are you on the Forbes, I'm making this up, 40 under 40, 30 under 30 in your own country of citizenship, right? Have you received other awards? Have your businesses received awards? Where have you gone to school? Were you a part of an incubator or accelerator program? But we look at all these different things, right, that show that you are a founder, entrepreneur of extraordinary ability. And basically, with the O1, the analysis focuses a lot more on the applicant than on the business only, while in the other cases, the focus is much more on the business and the money and sort of, and by other cases, I mean the E's and the L's, right, than the applicant himself. What is the one big advantage of the O visa that I see is that it doesn't require the foreign company to work for, right, like the L. You don't have to be for a treaty country. You can be from anywhere in the world. And it doesn't require money. Like the E visas or the L visas sort of require money too, because you have to form a new office. So the bottom line is, I see this visa very often used by startup founders, especially younger startup founders who are raising money, right, and are not really putting their own money in it, but they're putting in that that hard sweat equity to build their companies. That's where I see the O1 visa used, and that's its biggest advantage. Arguably, its biggest disadvantage is that the spouses of O1s who get O3 visas cannot work in the US. Children can go to school, but generally speaking, for people with families, that's a bit tough, especially if the spouse wants to obtain work authorization through it. But the O1, definitely an option that should be considered by any founder looking to start or any entrepreneur looking to start a business in the US. Then, in addition to these, there is the H-1B, which is a specialty occupation visa. It is the most common visa used by professionals who work in the US, right? It's a visa that employers apply for employees, right, who are foreign nationals to work in their companies. You have to show that it's a specialty occupation, basically that it's a professional occupation that requires at least a bachelor's degree. Generally speaking, most of these, very often the roles that the main, call it CEO, main executive at a company serves in will fall into the specialty occupation category. The H-1B is a bit trickier from these other visas in the sense that it does require a bona fide employer-employee relationship. So what that means is while you can own 100% of the business or up to 100% of the business, you don't have to own 100% of the business in the US, you cannot be the sole employee of this company. And what I mean by that is there has to be a bona fide, there has to be an employer and employee, and you have to remain an employee. So it generally requires at least someone in this corporate hierarchy above you who can direct your work and hire and fire you, right? So this is something that a lot of entrepreneurs who are used to, having complete control and do not want to involve others in businesses have a problem with. Now keep in mind, you can own 100% of the company, so you don't really lose control, but there is a requirement that you, in essence, have an employer, you have a manager, someone that's above you, someone, even if it's a board of directors that's not directly above you in the, officer hierarchy, someone that can have input on your work. And I know that can be, a problem for some entrepreneurs who don't want to do that, but I don't want to discount the H-1B because it is a viable option for many, and we've used it successfully for many entrepreneurs. Similarly to the O-1, spouses of H-1Bs, they're called H-4s, right, cannot work in the US. So that's a disadvantage of the H-1B, but children can go to school. Now, the next two visa categories, let's call them, I'm going to touch on more briefly because they apply to a much smaller set of individuals. So one visa category many of my clients use is what's referred to as F1 OPT. So the F1 is a student visa, right? If you're a foreign national student in the US, at the end of that F1 stay, like while you're going to school, after graduating, you get what's called optional practical training, OPT, and allows you to work in the US for 1 year after graduating. And during that 1 year, you are allowed to work for yourself. You're allowed to be self-employed. And what many of my clients do, these are all recent graduates, right? They use that first year after graduating from their degree program to work for themselves on OPT to launch this startup, to start this company. And then during that 1 year, they figure out which one of the other categories they're eligible for, right? And they often, change their status to whether it's in, E, H, L, O, one of the other ones I went over in this video. But F1 OPT is an interesting avenue to also start and launch a business. Obviously, it only applies to those who are already here as students. One quick, side note on this. You can own ownership in a company on F1 STEM OPT, which is an additional 2-year extension if you got a STEM degree in the US. That's a significantly more complicated process, and it's not as clear-cut when it comes to self-employment. I've recorded plenty of different videos on that. I don't want to go into that rabbit hole here. But the bottom line is F1 OPT can be used. STEM OPT to a lesser extent can be used too. Generally speaking, it's a step towards one of the other visa categories that I mentioned, but it's an interesting way to start a business because it has no requirement to invest money. All you have to do is basically actively work for the business, and the business, the company that you started has to, be properly formed, have all business licenses, and you have to show that it's related to what you studied, right? But it's definitely an option to consider. And then finally, there's the international entrepreneur rule. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I was never a big fan of this program. It's not really a visa category. It's not really a special, non-immigrant status. It's parole, which is, I tell everyone, is sort of a legal fiction where you're allowed to enter and be in the US even though you don't fall into one of the other categories is a good way to explain it. And basically, if you own 10% of a US startup, you started that startup within the last 10 years, and that startup has raised substantial amount of money from investors or government grants, or you can show that it will scale and grow, you can apply for this international entrepreneur rule, and which is, I believe, generally valid for 2.5 years, and then you can extend it. But the bottom line is, I was never a big fan of it, and my office doesn't file a lot of these cases, or frankly doesn't file any of these cases, simply because I don't like the parole nature. I feel like parole can be revoked at any time. It's much more flimsy of a status than any of the other ones. So I try to get my clients into one of the other statuses, especially when we're talking something like a company, a business, when there's money at stake, employees, etc. I want something much more firm than the international entrepreneur rule, but it's, you should know about it. I would be doing this video injustice if I don't mention it, at least, right? Now, those are the non-immigrant, the visa categories. Now, I want to briefly go over the permanent residence categories, and I'm aware the video is getting kind of long, so I don't want to belabor this, but basically, to obtain permanent residence, the first part of the process is filing of a petition, right? And think of it, the way I explain it to everyone is, think of it as, I want to reserve a green card for myself, and then when I'm ready, I apply for the green card. So there's generally two processes, which is, one is the petition. It's either an I-140 if we're talking based on employment, that's what we're discussing here, or an I-130 if it's based on a family relationship. And then there's what's called the adjustment of status, I-485 or DS-260 immigrant visa application, which is your own personal application to become a permanent resident. Now, in order to be able to file those personal applications, you need to have this petition. You need to file a petition, and the petition needs to be approved, which shows that you qualify, that USCIS, right, the US government, thinks that you fall into one of the enumerated green card permanent residence categories, and based on that, you should receive a green card. So there are a few that work very well for entrepreneurs, right, who want to start businesses. So the first one I'm going to talk about is EB1C, right? Some people call it EB13. The bottom line is it's the Multinational Manager Executive Green Card category, and it's very similar to the L1. You have to prove that you were, working abroad in an affiliated company in a managerial executive capacity, and that you're doing the same in the US, right, at the US affiliate branch. Now, the way I explain it to people is, think of it as an L1 on steroids. Basically, the organizations have to be bigger than you need to show that this job will allow the company to basically employ you permanently, right? So it's a higher burden, and it works best once the company has scaled. There's several employees in the US, obviously abroad too, and that basically this is the company's generating enough revenue to support this permanent position. But I do want to flag it because we use it very, very often. I think it's a great opportunity. Generally speaking, the strategy is come in on an L1, start the business on an L1 or an E2 or an E1. Frankly, it could be any of the other ones, but those are the most common ones. And then scale the company. And if the company is scaling and things are going well, then we can use this avenue to obtain permanent residence. So keep in mind, it's not a requirement that you be on an L1, but given the similarity in the requirements, many people go from L1 to this multinational manager green card, EB1C. The other one is EB1A, which is of extraordinary ability. And that's, again, it's a good way to think about it as an O1 extraordinary ability visa on steroids, right? You have to prove that you're extraordinary, that you're at the top of your field. Generally speaking, when it comes to startups and entrepreneurship, you truly, truly have to have had tremendous experience growing companies or running a startup for it to qualify, if that's going to be the basis for it, because you have to show that you're at the top of your field. And, there's so many companies out there to show that you're an entrepreneur at the top of your field is not easy, but it can be done. Has been done, and we do use it effectively. But I want to caution everyone, because there's so many, I get them in my feed all the time, these videos that have kind of make this EB1A category seem like it's just so easy and anyone can qualify for it, and that is simply not true, right? Like it's an extraordinary ability green card. It's reserved for those who are extraordinary. That being said, a lot of articles refer to it as the Einstein green card and the Einstein visa. I don't think you have to be one of the greatest scientists to ever walk the earth to qualify for it either, but you have to be extraordinary, right? And we've used it for entrepreneurs. Generally speaking, you have to have built a solid company to qualify for it, right? In the past, and have personal accolades too, right? Where like I said, the Forbes lists and all of that, especially if you've raised huge amounts of money, if you've made a lot of money in business, those are going to be good cases for EB1A. And then finally, there's the EB2 National Interest Waiver, which is basically you have to have at least a bachelor's degree and 5 years of progressive work experience post obtaining that bachelor's degree or a master's degree to qualify for it. But it's if you can show that, you know, the work that you're doing and like basically that your entrepreneurship endeavors are at a level that they're in the U.S. national interest and you're able to advance the U.S. national interest through this, then you can apply for a green card through that. And generally speaking, though, the arguments here are that, look, I raised this awesome company, I built this amazing startup, this amazing venture, and it's scaling, it's growing, it's employing Americans, and it's to the U.S. national interest if I continue doing which I'm doing, right? And there's many variations of these arguments because depending on what field you're in, right, you may be developing something that in and of itself, like the company that you're running may be developing something that's in the U.S. national interest too. But the bottom line is it's a very interesting avenue. I see this one used a lot by startup founders. It works well, especially if your startup is kind of picking up and scaling and employing people in especially if you're developing a product or some kind of service that is arguably in the U.S. national interest. It can be a very interesting option. And that's sort of it, right? Like now I tell everyone there's so many different variations of all this. There's so many different ways to use the various visa categories and the permanent residence categories to build out a strategy. There's definitely no one size fits all approach, but this sort of covers all of them that are easily applicable to entrepreneurs who want to start their own businesses in the US. If you have any questions, comments, related videos you want me to record, please post them in the comments because I'm looking to shoot videos that are helpful to you. The whole point of doing this is literally to help. And if I know what you guys are interested in, it'll help me record more videos. But anyway, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you coming to the channel. If you like the content, please subscribe and like it. That really, really helps me. And I'll do my best to record more videos. And thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.